Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast and newsletter all about how generative AI is changing the media, journalism, and the news. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and on this podcast, I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people helping build the AI-driven newsrooms of the future. I am excited today to welcome to the Media Copilot podcast, Brian Morrissey. Brian is the former editor-in-chief of Digiday. You probably know him better from his own podcast and newsletter, The Rebooting, which dives deep into what's going on in media and the ad market and has lots of fascinating guests. I've learned a ton from that podcast. I wholeheartedly suggest you subscribe. I can't wait to talk to him about how AI is changing all those things and what the future holds. So, Brian, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Cool. Thanks, Pete. Appreciate you inviting me on.
So, Brian, normally I talk about more like the pragmatic side of AI, like what the tools, the ethics, the workflow that sort of journalists and editors and, the people managing those people need to know about. But with you, I would love to dive a little bit more into the industry side and how media companies should be even thinking about this change in generative AI. So really, let's just get right into it. Like generative AI feels like ever since ChatGPT came out, it's basically hit the industry like a bomb. Like everyone is either experimenting or trying to figure it out, wrap their heads around it, and understand like this tidal wave that is essentially hit the media business or even the broader content business. So what's the first thing that you would say to media companies and the people running them? How should they be thinking about this massive change?
Yeah, I know the initial thing is scramble up a task force, blue ribbon committee. And that's, a typical response from publishers, or any company really to any new development. I think the big thing to me is to think about it in the context of what's going on right now with media businesses, because, I think sometimes when these things come about, we get into the speeds and feeds and the tactics, and they're very important. But the strategic framework and the environment is just as critical, right? And so I think for publishers and their businesses, it's arriving at a time where the zero interest rate era is over, right? And so things were difficult in publishing, and they're going to get more difficult. So if things were difficult during a time of rock bottom interest rates and then the pandemic just was an acceleration of that craziness, now it's a totally different environment. So it's going to get harder, in fact, for publishers. And then on top of that, I think when you think about AI arriving, it's just an acceleration of this shift that we're already seeing to do more with less. And so I think a lot of times businesses are going to look to AI to drive efficiencies, and that's just the reality of it. I know that a lot of journalists don't want to hear that because they think, oh no, they're going to take their jobs and stuff. But the reality is a lot of these businesses have to take costs out. And the only costs you have in media businesses really for the most part are people. And so a lot of these businesses, to be sustainable long-term, need to be smaller. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm a lot more optimistic for new models versus retrofitting existing models. I think a lot of the advantages of scale are disadvantages and even albatrosses now, because you can do more with less. And if you're starting from scratch, you don't have all of this infrastructure in order to revamp. So I think from that perspective, it's good for newcomers. And that inevitably it's going to be used by legacy players whose businesses are already challenged in order to cut costs, be more efficient.
Do you have anything in mind when you're thinking about what models you think might make sense in an AI world, and also given the trends we're seeing? Obviously, you're alluding to a lot of things that have been happening for years, like the drop off in referral traffic, right? Which was certain for social and now is even affecting search.
But it's accelerating. Any sort of page view based model is incredibly challenged, and it was challenging to begin with, but it's gotten even more challenging because the referral traffic has already fallen not off a cliff, but if you look at it over the years, it kind of has fallen off a cliff.
It's pretty steep hill.
Yeah. And I've not talked with one person who thinks that the shift to I always like mix up the words, the search generative experience. I think it should be the generative search experience, but whatever. Google can do what Google wants. I've yet to talk to anyone or who's experienced this or studies it or lives it that thinks that this is going to be a good result for publishers. At the end of the day, this entire industry to me is in the midst of structural change. It's not cyclical. So I think most businesses are used to dealing with cyclical challenges. That's, when the economy goes down, the ad market tracks GDP, and if GDP is contracting, then the ad market contracts, et cetera. Now, digital publishing was largely insulated from a lot of that because there was a structural shift in budgets from analog to digital. That shift has taken place. Most publishers did not benefit as much as they expected because a lot of that shift went to technology platforms. Well, I've got some bad news. Like the duopoly is now a full-on oligopoly, and you're not just going to be competing with Google and Facebook. It's Instacart, it's Target, it's every tech company, it's Uber. Retail media is taking budget from publishers. This is a structural challenge. There's less money to go around. On top of that, you have a lot of publishers who wedded themselves to page view models, putting an ad next to a piece of content. Most of the times the visitors arrived from Google or Facebook. Facebook has kneecapped that traffic. Google has already accelerated the number of zero-click searches. If you look at half of searches on mobile don't result in any clicks out. Google has been the nerve center of the open internet. I mean, I had a dinner the other week as part of my business model because I don't want to be wedded to just putting display ads next to content. And a publishing executive was like, and he's like, yeah, 5 years, I don't think the open internet really exists is a viable strategy. So, I don't mean to be doom and gloom, but
no, I think you're reflecting a lot of. I mean, one of my things I wanted to ask you about is kind of what you're hearing from the people you're talking to, and because I've certainly been hearing similar, I guess, thoughts and theories about what the internet looks like in the next few years, and it's not a pretty picture, or at least not for publishers.
I don't see how the open internet as it exists, like building an open internet publishing business. I mean, first, I think I would just look at like the kinds of publishing businesses that are being started now, and they're not really open internet businesses. If you think about a Semaphore, Puck, Punchbowl, these are going after rich niches. I sometimes say niche, sometimes I say niche. I don't know. Like British people freak out.
Sometimes you're Canadian, sometimes you're not.
Yeah, I don't know. I go both, but like it doesn't rhyme if I say niche. So they're going after rich niches because you can make money. You don't depend on the mechanisms of the open internet. I was talking with like a long time publishing executive and very successful one who's on to like a new business. He's like, the playbooks just are totally different. They don't work. The previous playbooks don't work. Take your SEO playbook, go outside to be safe and just burn it. Because you're not going to, I think we're seeing that. And it was totally predictable with the Messenger. I don't root for its demise or anything. I hope it doesn't. I took a lot of calls from people like, hey, should I go over there? I'm like, is the pay good? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I've always heard Jimmy pays well. So like, yeah, go take the money. But like, I would set some of it aside because you might not have a job. Like that's the reality. You know how it is. I mean, you're a journalist. You get a little bit of gallows humor about this whole thing. I mean, nobody who's been in this profession I don't think, do you know anyone who has like not lost their job?
There's a storied few who've been pretty good at this stuff.
Like kicked out of like your employment at some point. Is that common in every profession?
Depends how good you are at seeing the ground coming dropping out from under
Really?
you.
I don't think I know anyone who has not at some point, been laid off.
Yeah. No, that's true. Actually,
When
it would be.
magazine went under, so like that was my introduction to the field.
Yeah.
It set expectations appropriately, Pete.
Yeah. So for you're getting at something I really wanted to ask you about, which is what sort of legacy publishers can do with this sort of new environment. What I'm getting at is sort of the nuclear option, which I feel like we're starting to see the beginnings of with, I don't know if you saw the story about Reddit from the other week, I think, where they were talking about, at least internally, well, what if we just cut ourselves off from Google and everything?
Yeah.
And essentially like trying to get ahead of like, because, once what you described as generative AI search gets going and the access to information from media companies, whether it's the Times, News Corp, or whoever, is become this presumably valuable thing. Like, is that an option for any of these legacy players or the industry at large? So that like, hey, make a deal with us, or you just the people using your product won't have access to good information. Is that even leverage? I don't even know.
I mean, the reality is most publishers have limited to no leverage. And there are so many publishers out there. Like I covered ad agencies for a long time, and there's not as many ad agencies there are, but ad agencies would have similar grouses, right? So like clients would like come and be like, oh, you got to do all this like crazy stuff for a pitch. We're not going to pay you for it. And like, or we're just, hey, times are tough, losing at the track. So like our payment terms are now like net 360. And like, they would be like, this is outrageous. We got to say no. Guess what? The other person like was like, yeah, you first. Oh yeah, I'm totally down with that. And they would just undercut each other. The reality is publishing is the same. The New York Times and Barry Diller and definitely Rupert's not retired. He's still involved in it, I'm sure. They're gonna
There's gotta be some kind of time limit there. Right?
Camped out outside of lawmakers' offices, regulators' offices, and it is an insider's game. Who gets the any checks are going to get cut are going to go to the largest and most politically connected publishers. Oh, go figure. And so there's no savior coming to like help. And like the reality is, most publishers they might think that their content is super unique and that gives them leverage. The reality is a lot of it is replaceable, right? And so I think if you're sitting on unique data sets, absolutely. To me, it's like, how do you play defense and then how do you play offense? So the smartest strategies are like, how do we mitigate our downside risk? And the biggest downside risk is search changing. Search is the nerve center of the internet. When search catches a cold, the entire publishing industry gets sick. And Google might not even want to have to change, but it's going to be forced. As Satya Nadella said, it has to dance now. And when you see the generative search experience, it is going to send far less traffic to publishers. Now, to be fair, a lot of this traffic was, SEO, to me, just like gimmickry. A lot of...
Oh, absolutely.
Every publisher has about... That's why I find this like new... Have you been following this kind of, I call it a moral panic about made for advertising sites?
No. What is that?
There's this like... These pop up every now and again, these moral panics. It's like Reefer Madness, but for digital media. That was like ad blocking was a moral panic and all this like stuff. Now it's like made for advertising sites. And these are the sites that are ginned up. Oftentimes they get traffic through like content rec networks, like the Outbrains and Tabulas.
Right. Okay.
They load it down with, what my podcast partner Troy Young would say, ad density, meaning like, they're going to come at you with the autoplay from the top.
Right. Sure.
Bottom, and then both sides.
Okay. I know what you're talking about.
And then when you scroll, it's going to be sticky, Yeah, it's that. It's like, so, there was a report that like a giant chunk of programmatic ad budgets are going to these quote unquote MFA sites, but nobody can define them. And when they put down like the the markers that you might be an MFA,
Mm-hmm.
you could say some of them apply absolutely to what quote unquote premium publishers are out there
Oh,
doing.
sure. I've seen horrible ad experiences on legit sites.
But even like buying traffic, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
like, let's not get like our knickers in a twist. Like buying traffic is a regular feature of modern digital publishing. In fact,
we just don't talk about it much.
But it's going to become like an absolute necessity because like having organic reach is like up and down. The reason that the viral sites never worked to some degree as businesses was because that unpredictable traffic is just really difficult to deal with. And having predictable distribution is the cornerstone of a media business. And media has never they've given over their distribution to platforms because of the structure of the internet. And it's impossible to control your businesses when you don't control your distribution, when you're always at the mercy of somebody else who has a different agenda than you. Because I write a lot about misalignment. And I think a lot of the problems that publishers have faced is through a lack of alignment all through the ecosystem. And, the interests of platforms have proven time and again to be misaligned with the interests of premium publishers, I would say, however you want to define them. Top publishers who are creating like quality content that supposedly was going to attract quality audiences and will be supported with quality advertising. That was what we were promised.
Right. Well, and now in the generative AI age, there's what you just said there about MFA sites and these ad-ridden sites. Like, I don't see any reason why those sites aren't just going to proliferate and get crazy as sort of the cost to create those turns to zero, essentially.
So if you look at it with publishers, it's like the magic of the open internet was that anyone could publish, right? You could stand in a publishing business. And the fact that there are so many publishers is remarkable. And that is a big win for the open internet. Like, publishing as an industry was far more concentrated. It was far more of an insider game. You had people who were true gatekeepers. Okay, that's gone. The problem is the cost of competing on the internet has, gone down so low that scarcity is gone. And scarcity has always driven media business models. And now with the cost of creation going to zero, then like you certainly can't, if it's hard to compete on like a scale and like I'm going to put an ad next to content, like a display, like it's going to be completely impossible. I don't know how more impossible it can be.
So it seems like we're kind of getting here.
Trying to like diversify their models. Even the people who were built and their expertise is in running businesses and understanding the mechanics and having a playbook to get a bunch of eyeballs on a web page that you will monetize through basically display, some form of display adjacency. And even those people are going with different models that are smaller, models that are not dependent on your Comscore uniques, models that are very services heavy. Services are, one of my other podcast partners, Alex Schleifer, who's not in this industry, thankfully for him, says that it's like the only worse business model than publishing is agency. And so you're getting the worst of like several models, but like that is to me like an escape valve because services are not something that you're competing with Google and Facebook and any of the other technology companies.
Well, what do you mean services exactly? Can you pin that down a bit?
These services, creating content and experiences on behalf of a brand, acting like an
Oh, I see. Gotcha.
like I use the example like on one of my podcasts I had on Jason Wagenheim, the CRO of Bustle. And Bustle is started by Brian Goldberg. And Brian is like an OG digital publishing guy. I hate that word, OG. I can't believe we used it. We have to edit that. He's like an original publishing guy. Started. He was one of the founders of Bleacher Report, mastered SEO, and then went on to start Bustle as basically like, okay, we're going to like take out Condé and Hearst and own the like women's publishing lifestyle segment by applying the same playbook. Well, they threw that out.
They got pretty far, but
they're onto a different playbook. They're making their money off of like the Nylon House at like Art Basel and Coachella, where they're like becoming like cultural general contractors. They're bringing in a bunch of influencers. Bustle has the brand partnerships, the brand relationships, the infrastructure to pull these things off, and they package it all up. They buy ads. The results that they're delivering are more like PR metrics with, because it gets covered in all sorts of different places, and then the influencer amplification and stuff. That's a very different business than like running an SEO, oriented business about getting people to a web page to show them ads.
Okay. So I feel like where we're shaking out here is that if you're small enough to be nimble and adapt to this coming environment and niche enough, then you've got a good chance. If you're mid-sized to large, you've got to pivot in the way sort of Bustle has and diversify. And for the majors, I feel like we never really concluded on whether. I think we concluded the nuclear option probably isn't going to work. And they're just going to have to sort of have their own sort of federated chunk of the internet. If you're like the New York Times and you have a pretty strong platform, maybe that works.
Well, I mean, the New York Times is the exception to every rule, right? Like, I mean, they've built an incredible lifestyle bundle. They've been able to, I mean, to me, it's going to be an interesting case study, right? Because when you go back to 2016, they cut their TAM, right? Like they pivoted really hard into a progressive political position that really drove a ton of engagement with people who hated Donald Trump. And they wrote off 40% of the TAM of news consumers, right? Like 40% of people who consume news will never, ever, ever, ever be customers of the New York Times. Doesn't matter what you think about Donald Trump, but that's like an interesting business decision to cut your TAM, because the number of people who will pay for news was already small. I remember doing a podcast with Meredith Levine, and I was like, I don't understand how you can possibly hit these numbers. There's not enough people who will pay for news.
Right.
And then on top of that, then when Trump came around, they even cut that by basically writing off a big chunk of the news consuming market. What I didn't see was that they would be able to build a lifestyle bundle. They've got games, they've got sports, with Wirecutter now in the mix. So
it's almost like they almost did niche in their own way. You can't be niche in the New York Times, but in that sense.
I mean, even the people who are building quote unquote scale models, what I end up hearing from them is that they're thinking about it as like a collection of niches, right? I think it's like using some of the terminology of the moment, retrofitting and stuff like this. But if you really listen to like what say Emma Tucker is saying at like the Wall Street Journal, like this is a real back to basics moment, right? The Journal at one point was going to compete with the New York Times to be a national general news publication. Like no more. Like their niche is capitalism, and they're for the capitalists, and they're going to like grow within that niche. And I think that is probably a healthy development. I think we went through like a crazy period where people were trying to be all things to all people, and some of that was VC driven. But the reality is there aren't going to be very many billion-dollar digital publishing businesses. That's okay. I think there can be dozens and hundreds of small and nicely profitable digital media businesses.
So you mentioned Wirecutter when we were talking about the Times and their bundle. That got me curious. Like, how do you see commerce, that business model, playing out in a generative AI search-driven era? Because you have people searching. They still want their recommendations, right? They're still going to their AI agents or whatever, asking for the best this or the best that. It serves it up. Is that a thing that might be a potential, I don't know, partnership between these AI companies and publishers, or does it matter? I mean, like, how? Because presumably people are going to want to transact, and they're going to have to go somewhere to do that, or just tell their AI to transact. Or do publishers matter in this space? Do we even need that middleman?
It's a good question. I don't know how that's going to play out, because I think, like, when we talk about like commerce, we're really talking about affiliate, and when we talk about affiliate, we're really talking about SEO, because you can go to these websites and go to their commerce. So that's not what the play is. The play for most of these companies is to use their search authority that they got for a totally different purpose in order to also send a catalog into the search results. So, at its best, these publishers have not just like Google domain authority, but have real domain authority that they can then transfer into like a commercial context. The reality is it's so over optimized, and you can see the ones with the most like agro commerce operations. Like Penske must have, like, all their publications are so jacked to the gills on, you search for like something that has nothing to do with Rolling Stone, and Rolling Stone will have like a shopping page on it. And this happens all the time in publishing. I remember years ago, we at Digiday, we wrote a story about how these publishers had SEO, Funny or Die, had an SEO operation that they had a web page for like child rape. And it was done because they just like were optimizing, and they would just create pages based off of these, like, tying in like, search trends and stuff like this. And I'm like, if your model, and they're like, it was a total accident. I'm like, if your model leaves open this happening, your model is, you really need to reassess like what you're doing.
You've gone down a dark path there. Yeah, for sure.
And, I think the story of digital publishing in some ways is that it can't help itself. It optimizes itself into these weird, grimy places. And then on the other hand, it whines about how, trust is so low and all this stuff. And
this is why I feel like there's an opportunity with commerce. And as we're thinking about it, I was just just to think out loud a bit, in that people still need recommendations. People still need to think about what's the best thing. And if you have, maybe it's a differentiated agent that is specifically for that, so you don't go to like a generic Chat GPT for it. And maybe that becomes like, it's almost like niche agents for different things. And maybe something happens in terms of an agent for news. So again, we have to think through that. But
I think a big problem with a lot of these things, just to maybe abstract it a little bit too much, is too many features of digital media monetization are, one, they're adversarial to the audience, or two, they're about adding friction, not taking it away. I mean, think about like all the different ways that publishers typically make money. And a lot of times they're really just adding friction to a process. So all the like SEO'd commerce pages, they're just like, they're interstitial pages. Like, it was said to me, I think secondhand, maybe it was directly, that Google views affiliate as an invasive species. People running
Interesting.
Google search view it as an invasive species because it's an arbitrage play. And so like publishers on the one hand, that's why I sort of struggle. I mean, we're all hypocrites in our own ways, but like publishers complain sort of rightfully about a lot of things that they themselves are also guilty of. Perhaps not to the extent. It's like, I'm like, wait, you're complaining about this thing, but you guys also do that. We're like, well, but not as much. Like, okay, can you tell me which degree is okay? Like, okay.
So when you say it's an arbitrage play, can you break that down for me? What do you mean exactly by that?
Meaning, like, they're using their domain authority arbitrage to get.
Oh, I see.
So they're just they're creating the content for the algorithm. That's why I find this like made for advertising. Like, this is made for algorithm content. It's not made for users content. Like, it's made for algorithms. I think you can claim that it's like intent based and all this stuff. If you look at the execution on a lot of them, I mean, come on, they're ginning up tons and tons of these pages. And the reality is now with AI,
all the same subheads,
all going to be like created. And they're not even, they're going well beyond the areas. Many of these publishers are going well beyond the areas in which they have any quote unquote expertise in it at all. Right? Like, what makes them, this starts from the fact that they have domain authority. They would not be doing this if they did not rank highly in search. Right? Like, they're not making money off of their loyalists this isn't a newsletter strategy where people are signing up for their like, oh yes, give me your like deals of the week. Like, that's not what's happening here.
Yeah.
Not in most cases, I don't think. I could be wrong. Like, I mean, I think there's places like Wirecutter that have established themselves like, and I'm not saying like, any SEO is bad, but like, the reality is it's an SEO strategy.
Well, and it touches on sort of, I think, the realities of Google. I think there's often, I find this, I'd be curious of what you find. There's almost too much faith. Not that there's a lot of faith, but people seem to think like Google is going to favor the best information. And I think on some level they certainly want to. But I think, to me, like the blinders were off years ago when, the first sort of occurred to me that Google, not the first time, but like when they were hyping Google Plus sites instead of Facebook sites during the age of social, and basically adapting their algorithm so that in their own self-interest, because of course they would, like, why wouldn't you? And
gambling on Casablanca kind of thing, right?
Yeah, but it's just a reminder that they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot, even though Gen AI, that's not something they alone could stop anyway, even though it sort of threatens their model to some extent.
I mean, even Google itself doesn't still trot out that "don't be evil" stuff. So they're a massive for-profit company run by a guy from McKinsey. So I don't know.
So when I think about what Gen AI means for both content and the ad market, right? Because they're obviously very intertwined in that. Cost of content goes to zero. All these sites that were, low quality, mediocre quality, ad driven sites proliferate. Yes, it's probably in the reader interest to filter those out and bring them like quote unquote real publishers with good content, but it is not in Google's interest, right? So it's a little bit like I don't know where, and I always try to put myself in the mind of a future news consumer and like the experiences they're going to have. And like I say, we've gone down a few different roads here in this conversation already, but they all seem to be going to sort of a not darker, but like, it's almost like back in the days of AOL and like this really federated web of different things. And you've got to really be savvy about it to find the things that you want. I just feel like that's sort of where we're headed.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you said was important, like of being sort of user centric, right? Like, because I think one of the big, you can sort of like, it's like a don't hate the player, hate the game kind of thing, but there's just simply too many adversarial practices that are accepted as part of the publisher toolkit at the end of the day. Whether that's aggro, autoplay, a lot of the modern publishing experience, yeah, I think Troy says it reeks of desperation, and it's simply adversarial, and at best, it's seeing how much you can get away with before people freak out. I think AI is going to eventually give people the easy tools where this lopsided bargain, they don't have to make it at all. And you don't have a right to exist as a business. That's not how it works. And, being misaligned with your audience has always seemed very strange to me. And I understand you're trying to solve different constituencies, because a lot of times in an ad model, your customers are different than your audience. And you also have to satisfy platforms. I mean, I always go back to, recipe sites and the stupid backstory, and the fact that a jump to recipes button even exists in this world is because there is no focus on the end user. You have to serve the needs of the platform first. All the autoplay video and the strategically tiny X button to lead to accidental ad clicks. I don't see how that lasts. I just don't. It'd be like a restaurant, being you know what, we're gonna and then they're going through their plan, and the last thing they think about are the people actually eating the food.
It's funny. It's almost like you're pivoting into an optimistic take, in a sense, for users anyway, because it's I agree with you. That's terrible. It can't last. Theoretically, from a user experience standpoint, a generative AI might fix that problem, right? Because then it's just give me the damn recipe, and I don't even need to hit a button.
I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I feel like I'm realistic, and the reality is people respond to incentives, right? And the misalignment that exists in publishing isn't because there's some evil people out there or something like that. It's because the incentives that are in place are push people to taking actions that are anti-user at the end of the day. They don't have the interest in it. I mean, one of the good things about subscriptions, I just did this subscriptions report, and the news is pretty mixed. Most people, the overwhelming majority of publishers are expecting, minimal growth in their subscription program. So it's another another silver bullet that turned out not to be a silver bullet. But one of the things that's I think is good about it is it's a force function to start to treat your audience as customers, even if it's only 5 to 10%. It helps, right? Because everyone's been in the meetings where you raise your hand. I feel like it's always those of us from the editorial side. I just had a talk with a client. It's well, who's the stakeholder who's advocating for the audience? I'm at best, it's the editorial, and they're then treated like children who are come on, what are you saying? You just want world peace. You don't want to make money. And we've all been
echoing. It's very familiar what you're saying.
Yeah, we've all been sales-splained, by the guys with the nice teeth and the hair. And they've driven these businesses into the ground. So I'm maybe you should move aside. Maybe we should listen to the editorial people. You guys screwed this up for a generation. You've had your shot. But I think that inevitably you end up getting more aligned with your customers overall. An example is this one major publisher was saying how they stopped showing autoplay, or they stopped showing pre-roll at all to their subscribers, because the data shows that the LTV of a subscriber, and then the fact that if they're engaged in video, their churn is actually quite a bit lower, and so it doesn't make sense to put that friction in front of a user. I'm a realist. You have to make money, and sometimes you got to go to the brand ATM, and you've got to add friction to a process. That's just life. Right. But there's too much of it, and I think when people start to think in LTV instead of just the short-term RPM, that's a very positive development.
Nice.
I'm using my acronyms.
No, it's all good.
It confers fake authority. That's right.
Long-term value, everyone. So pivoting just a little bit, I mean, you mentioned earlier, the executives camped out on the street in front of these regulatory bodies. Is that anything? Is regulation anything here? Does it matter how the government tries to rein in AI companies at this point with respect to whatever safety, misinformation, et cetera?
I mean, look, I'm like the cliche, you control what you can control and you make peace with the rest, right? Like outside of a very small group of publishers, it's hard to see how these kind of leaning on the government and cutting some deal or like, you got to adapt. I always think like, operating in as like a publisher is like being like a villager in the Game of Thrones, right? Like you got these massive houses doing these like battles and like just trampling on the like the people who live in the towns. You ever notice no one really thought much about like the people living in like
right.
Some of the towns.
Random village here.
Flea Bottom was one of the towns. Nobody's thinking people living in Flea Bottom. And
never got into that franchise, unfortunately.
Okay. Publishers are living in Flea Bottom. And they're just trying not to get caught in the dragon fire and stuff. So I don't think, you're writing about this all the time, right? I mean, this technology is out there. It's not going to go backwards. I don't think outside of like maybe gene splicing, I don't think, remember with Dolly and the sheep, I think they sort of put that thing back.
Oh, not Dolly, but Dolly. There you go. I remember Dolly. Yeah, that was like late 90s.
The panic that we were going to have all this weird, we were messing with nature too much. And then it just sort of went away. So I don't know what happened to that. But outside of that, technology marches on. Yeah. We're a technological species. We're going to keep pushing forward.
Yeah. So I'm curious, are you using AI in your work at all these days?
Yeah, I am. But for me, it's like, I think in terms of VORP, I think it's the NBA, the like value over a replacement player. And so I have a very stripped down model. I have a couple people who help me out on, business function, some stuff with like client service and I have a podcast producer and stuff like this, but I'm focused as much as possible on having as lean of a model as possible, because I believe that you can do so much. You have to do more with less, but I believe you can do way more with fewer resources and a lighter infrastructure. And so I look at AI tools to like speed that up, whether it's, cleaning up podcast transcripts in which I like grab quotes out of, or whether it's, doing newsletter art or, reports like with the images and stuff like this. I mean, I love designers and stuff. I don't have but the reality is if I can save on like an Illustrator, that's amazing. That I have to take that opportunity. So I look at it mostly as anything that I can do to get, particularly to apply to those areas of the business where I add no particular value. I don't use it for writing or anything like that because I don't know.
Yeah, I'm
maybe. I don't know.
I'm similar. I
know better still.
Yeah, exactly. Like I feel like AI in terms of like the creative process and particularly, just doing stories, the efficiencies are there, but it's not really replacing it. Maybe on the image side, and we could talk about that for a minute if you want. But I do feel like this is partly what sort of gives me a little hope for the future, right? Because it's like in a world of mediocre content, there's a side of like, it's a junk, but that human element still matters, and there will be still a demand for that, at least until AIs get really, really, really good.
Yeah, I look at it exactly because I use ChatGPT like every day, right? Like, but I don't know. I mean, maybe this. I'm sure the people who use DALL-E, not the
not the sheep,
but I'm sure illustrators who use it are like, this is kind of crap. And maybe I feel the same way where I'm like, ChatGPT. I'm like, my God. I'm like, if I can't like do better than, I saw this thing that like Gannett got accused of using AI for reviewed.com like reviews.
Oh, okay.
I had to like issue a statement saying, actually, it was a freelancer. And I was like laughing. I'm like, man, that is tough scenes for this freelancer.
But I'd also like
the boss to say like your AI.
But I would also, I mean, you probably shouldn't use DALL-E because of what the training data and whatever. But in terms of like getting accused of using an AI to illustrate something, I'd like to see them respond, yeah, so. Like
no, Review.com, it was like that they had used that they were publishing AI generated reviews.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's not as good.
And they said, no, actually, we hired a marketing agency that used a freelancer, and that this is the freelancer's work.
Oh, gotcha.
So,
well, maybe they were using it, but anyway, I thought you meant the imagery.
Maybe they were using it, but like the reality is, like, for me, like I just don't feel like, and I think we'll end up seeing it. Look, the most protected areas of media are going to be the ones that have the most human connection and the human touches. I personally am very focused on conversation, and whether it's a conversation like we're having right now, or to me, it's a form of like writing. Like I write a newsletter as a newsletter. Like I don't write it as a web page that's delivered by email sometimes, or is it like I write it like a letter. And just the same as this conversation has had asides and that kind of thing. Like, I think it's just a different form that is maybe, I'm sure a lot of like AI people will be like, oh, well, AI will be able to do that. AI will be able to do that. I'm like, okay, I heard the same thing about Web3. I don't know. But I think it's going to be a little bit I think if there is going to be one protected area that that the robots won't do as well, I think it's the most human areas, because humans are like more random, more chaotic and interesting than robots, at least the robots I've met.
Cool. Yeah, I like that. So just to wrap things up here, I want to ask you, if you had to pick one thing that to tell media folks and journalists and really anyone interested in, what the future of this industry is going to look like, what is the one thing they should know about generative AI?
About generative AI? I mean, I think it's just that it's not going to be stopped, right? Like there's, the Kubler-Ross like stages of like grieving. Like they go from like denial, bargaining, and then accept. It's time to move on to like acceptance. Like this is coming. It's real. The good news is this industry. This is about the 15th existential challenge that the industry has faced in the last 10 years. So what's another one to the pile? I mean, I don't know. Like I was watching Last of Us. It's like pretty soon after you've been attacked by hordes of zombies, it's like, okay, here we go again. Another horde of zombies. Let's do it. So I think that is just getting. I saw publishers who wasted too much time in the last era complaining, and I think I understand that to some degree. But it doesn't really do much, particularly about complaining about stuff in which you cannot really realistically have much of it, if any, impact on. So reorient your models, do stuff that platforms can't, do stuff that AI, at least right now, cannot do. Like if you're doing straight commodity content, I don't know what to tell you. Like that's not a good place to be. If you have straight commodity content, and your model is very dependent on SEO and monetizing through display advertising, and you have no like appreciable like first party data assets, no path to subscriptions, cannot activate your audience to like come to like an event or wear the t-shirt, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a lot of good things to say, but if you've got a small audience of people in a high value area who are really into what you're doing and want to congregate with each other under your convening auspices, you'll be fine. It's not a problem.
Nice. Might be time to pivot, guys out there. Brian, this has been great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation. Hey, where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, I mean, subscribe to the rebooting.com. I send out the newsletter 3 times a week, and I have 2 podcasts. One is called The Rebooting Show, in which I talk each week with someone who's operating a sustainable and resilient media business and try to get into the weeds of their model and how it works. And then I have another show that's a little bit different. It's called People versus Algorithms. It's me. It's the former president of Hearst Magazines and the former head of design at Airbnb. And it's more of like, I don't know if it's like an all-in style podcast, but it goes across tech, media, and culture. And we all bring different viewpoints on it. We have guests sometimes, but it's more of a discussion show.
Nice. Be sure to check those out, folks. You have been listening to The Media Copilot. You can subscribe to the newsletter at mediacopilot.substack.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at The Media Copilot. Be seeing you in the future.